Celebrating Soviet youth in August 1939, there was little hint of a threat of coming war. But many of these young people from the 12 Soviet republics would be dead within 2 years, and millions of Soviet children would be without parents. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, declared war on Germany in September 1939. In America, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Neutrality Act, keeping America out of the war for the time being. Red Square, Moscow, November the 7th, 1940. Elite Soviet troops are reviewed by their commander, Marshal Timoshenko, in a traditional military ceremony. Timoshenko addresses his troops in the presence of Joseph Stalin and of high-ranking military officers. He tells his soldiers that the independence of the Soviet Union is in their hands. He says that the safety of the Soviet people, their houses, factories, collective farms, and dams is their responsibility. If they're called on to use their weapons, they must use them well. Within 5 weeks, Hitler will issue his Directive Number 21, Operation Barbarossa, his plan to invade the Soviet Union. As the spring of 1941 took over from the cold of the Russian winter, life for ordinary Soviet citizens went on much as it had for hundreds of years, ruled by the rhythm of seasonal changes, far from considerations of war and turmoil. As the weather warmed, there was no inkling of the fact that a few hundred miles to the west, Germany was beginning to make moves towards invasion. Since December 1940, the Luftwaffe had been flying over Soviet territory on daily reconnaissance missions, but when Stalin was told, he ordered the Red Air Force to ignore them. By the spring of 1941, the sound of German aircraft in the skies above Russian territory went almost unnoticed. The German forces distributed a Russian-language manual featuring phrases like "hands up" and "surrender." Stalin ordered it to be ignored. Swarms of aircraft flew over Red Square on May Day, the 1st of May, 1941. They looked impressive, especially to ordinary citizens. But Soviet military planners watching on that day knew well that most of the planes in the skies over the Kremlin were all but obsolete. In spite of the thrill they provided for the onlookers, they were no match for the superb equipment of the German Luftwaffe, which was already massing on the western borders of the Soviet Union. Early in June 1941, Soviet authorities received reports from Switzerland and Japan that Hitler was planning to invade Russia on June the 22nd. The information gave a precise account of the German battle order and its objectives. Soviet experts considered it too detailed to be true. On June the 18th, a German soldier deserted. He expected punishment for striking an officer. He not only confirmed the date of the invasion, but gave the hour it was due to begin, 3:55 a.m. Stalin said the information could not be trusted. At 3:15 on the morning of June the 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Many Russian aircrews were on weekend leave and others were asleep. Within hours, Hitler appeared to have achieved his aim of putting the Soviet Air Force out of commission. Russian forces were confused. There was no immediate counter-offensive. Not until 4 hours after the attack was launched did Stalin order the Red Air Force to retaliate and destroy the enemy with powerful blows. Hitler could not believe the extent of his success. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering even ordered a recount of the Soviet planes destroyed. There were more than 2,500. In the first month of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe claimed to destroy 7,500 Soviet aircraft, while losing only 770 of its own. But statistics can mislead. The Red Air Force had indeed lost almost 70% of its numbers, but the Luftwaffe's apparently smaller losses wiped out a devastating 60% of the planes available on the Eastern Front. In Washington, D.C., at the Soviet Embassy, Ambassador Umansky made a comment that must have seemed highly optimistic at the time.
Hitler has miscalculated. Ours is a nation of a moral and political unity and strength unknown in the past. It is firmly organized, devoted to its leaders, and has utmost confidence in its armed forces, which are ready for any test. Hitler's attack against my country will be smashed.
The German forces advanced into Russia. In Moscow, the population waited, hearing daily news of the German progress, and then, in mid-July, when the way to Moscow stood open to the German army, Hitler made a decision that was to provide a reprieve for Stalin and the capital. He decided to consolidate the flanks of his army and postponed his advance on Moscow till the end of September. There were 3 bombing raids on Moscow in late July, but no great damage was inflicted. As Moscow prepared for attack, the Russian summer wore on into autumn and the weather cooled. Every passing day turned the situation a little more in favor of the Soviet capital. Reinforcements arrived in Moscow from Siberia and the Far East. In Russia, there is a period of heavy rain called Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. And as the Muscovites filled their sandbags and dug their defenses, it approached, apparently unconsidered by the German commanders. From the outskirts of the city to Red Square in the center, Moscow was placed on the defensive. People from surrounding areas streamed into the refuge of their capital. On September the 30th, as planned, Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, his advance on Moscow. By now, there were 600 fighter aircraft ready to defend the city, half of them the new Yaks, MiGs, and Lags. On October the 7th, the Rasputitsa struck. It rained, and by the afternoon, much of Hitler's forces were bogged down. Soviet aircraft could take off from their paved airstrips at will, but the Luftwaffe pilots found themselves stuck on muddy fields. The pilots defending the Moscow area were among the best in the Soviet Air Force. Some were test pilots from the design bureaus drafted into service. Luftwaffe fighter tactics in the early weeks of Barbarossa demonstrated that Soviet tactics were outmoded, and the Red Air Force pilots worked hard to develop new theories of aerial combat. What the Soviet pilots lacked in skill and tactical knowledge was to some extent compensated for by their fighting spirit and patriotic zeal. After the battle for Moscow, Guards Air regiments would be created, in which pilots took an oath saying, "I swear to you, my country, and to you, my native Moscow, that I will fight relentlessly and destroy the fascists." With Moscow under threat of invasion, children were moved out, and so were armament and aircraft factories. Factories were dismantled, transported behind the distant Ural Mountains, and rebuilt so that production of war materials could be resumed in safety. It was a project of immense size and hardship, most of it taking place in late autumn and winter. Alexander Yakovlev left Moscow for Novosibirsk in style. He drove a Pontiac, which he had to abandon for a train, and then a plane. When he reached the site of his new factory, he found problems with missing parts, and unfinished aircraft were buried under feet of snow. But with drive and improvisation, work continued, and 3 weeks after Yakovlev arrived, the first operational Yak-1 was rolled out. Those who arrived at the new factories had to cope with shortages of food, tools, and materials. But somehow, a year after the massive move, the factories behind the Ural Mountains were producing new military aircraft at the rate of 2,000 a month. Evolution of the fighters was rapid. Weight and drag were reduced in the Yak-1M. The Yak-3 was another step forward in performance. When the Yak-3 entered service in July 1943, it was superior to both the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109G at altitudes below 16,000 feet. In spite of the incredible achievement of moving the factories out and making them productive, Stalin was not satisfied. When the counteroffensive from Moscow began in late 1941, he saw a need for greater range for Soviet fighters and pressured the design bureaus to give it to him. That pressure passed down the line to the factories already working under impossible conditions. Many aircraft were delivered unfit to fly in combat, and overtaxed ground crews were forced to do work that should, under normal circumstances, have been completed in the factories. Nevertheless, the new Yak fighters performed well. Pilots learned on the job and in master classes conducted by new fighter aces. One of their first tasks was to overcome a deeply ingrained fear of the Luftwaffe. Then they had to learn to fight on the dive and on the climb. They had to learn to use sun and cloud cover. They had to become more aggressive and determined so that they could use the great potential of their new thoroughbred high-performance machines. Growing aggression and skill among fighter pilots had to be tempered with prudence. By the summer of 1942, the number of new fighters available was still small. It was important to keep as many planes as possible flying while numerical strength built up. This is a Yak-3. In the original Yak-1, the pilot's canopy was not raised. The rear of the fuselage ran straight back from the top of the cockpit, and pilot visibility was poor. The first major modification to the design was to cut down the rear fuselage and install a canopy with all-round vision. A two-seat trainer version, designated Yak-7V, performed so well that it was converted and fitted out as a night fighter with the designation Yak-7A. It's confusing that the Yak-7 appeared before the Yak-3 and the Yak-7V appeared before the Yak-7A, but that's the way it happened. The Yak-3 had a more powerful Klimov engine and a constant-speed propeller. It was very maneuverable and considered to be an extremely formidable close combat fighter. The key to the success of Yaks was strength and simplicity. The Klimov engine was easy to maintain even under harsh field conditions. Cockpit instrumentation was simple. One Red Air Force colonel